the young and the restless spoilers shock. The day had started with an air of anticipation and romance that blanketed the world of Genoa City in something rare hope. Kyle, a man often burdened by legacy, betrayal, and impossible expectations, had finally taken a step that felt entirely his own. In front of Claire, the woman who had shaken his defenses and reached something tender and untouched within him. He dropped to one knee and asked a question that would redefine the course of both their lives. The engagement ring sparkled with more than just diamonds. It carried the weight of their shared vulnerability, defiance, and the audacity to dream of a future untouched by past sins. For a moment, time held its breath, and in that moment, Claire said yes. Her voice trembled with disbelief, with love, with excitement. Their kiss was not just a kiss, it was a declaration. They had chosen each other in a world that constantly tried to pull them apart, and as word of the engagement spread, so did the shockwaves. The audience watching from the wings of this drama, both within the show and beyond the screen, were riveted. Fans across social media erupted with support, sharing clips of their most tender scenes, fan edits of the proposal, and heartfelt messages celebrating a love that had bloomed despite the storm. There was something undeniably magnetic about Kyle and Claire Atwow's souls scarred by history, but still open to something fragile and true. They hadn't done anything wrong, many pointed out. They hadn't schemed their way into this romance. They hadn't hurt others for the sake of personal gain. Their love was, by all appearances, clean, redemptive, and perhaps that was what made it dangerous to those who had become too comfortable living in a web of manipulation, legacy, and control. Behind the veil of smiles and congratulations, however, darker currents churned. Diane Jenkins, Kyle's mother, watched the news of the engagement with growing tension in her chest. She said all the right things, forced smiles, polite nods, but inside, the walls of her carefully curated world were trembling. She had spent years trying to shape Kyle into the son she envisioned, powerful, cautious, loyal to blood above all else. Claire didn't fit into that design. Not because Claire wasn't smart or kind or even loyal. She was all of those things, but because she was unpredictable. She wasn't part of the Abbott lineage, and to Diane, that meant she couldn't be trusted. The fear, unspoken but visceral, was that Claire might pull Kyle away from the family orbit, away from Jabbit, away from her. Her disapproval cloaked itself in phrases like concern and caution, but the truth was simpler. Diane didn't want to share control of her son with anyone, especially not someone like Claire. Jack Abbott, ever the patriarch and torchbearer of the Abbott legacy, had his own misgivings. His heart carried the bruises of generations of love lost, of loyalty betrayed. Claire, to him, was an unknown quantity. Her recent arrival in Genoa City, her mysterious ties to the Newman family, and the scars of her own past made her, in his eyes, a risk Kyle didn't need to take. His opposition was less fiery than Diane's, but more insidious in its restraint. He simply questioned Kyle's timing, suggested they wait, pushed gently against the tide without realizing he was reinforcing the very currents Kyle was trying to swim against. To Jack, love was never simple. It was always entangled with duty, business, and the looming shadow of Victor Newman, a man who loomed now more than ever in the equation. Victor's disdain for the engagement was hardly subtle. The mustache had seen Claire as a pawn in larger games before, and though she had proven her intentions time and again, Victor's trust was a fortress few ever breached. Kyle, in Victor's mind, was not worthy of tying himself to Newman blood, and the fact that Claire had chosen him over a future within the powerful Newman dynasty felt, to Victor, like betrayal. He whispered doubts to Nikki, to Victoria, even to Nick. He dropped comments that seemed innocuous, but were barbed with meaning. He spoke to Claire only when necessary, and with the kind of tone that suggested her choices were foolish and temporary. For Victor, love was never enough. Power was the only currency that mattered. And Claire, by choosing Kyle, had cashed in all her chips for something he believed could never last. But love does not ask for permission, And Claire Botiful, stubborn, wounded, was determined to celebrate this moment on her own terms. After the proposal, she hugged Kyle tightly, whispered something only he heard, and slipped away into the night with the ring still warm on her finger. She wanted space, not because she doubted Kyle, but because she needed to breathe, to let the emotion of the day settle. Rain had begun to fall, a quiet drizzle turning the streets slick under the cold veil of night. Claire slid behind the wheel of her car, heart pounding, smile lingering. She turned the music up, filling the silence with lyrics that spoke of hope, of new beginnings, of futures not yet written. But fate does not always align with joy. The rain thickened, and so did the fog. Claire's hands gripped the wheel loosely as her mind drifted toward Kyle, toward their future, toward the family she might one day build with him. She didn't notice how fast she was going. She didn't see the curve ahead in time. The tires skidded against the wet pavement, a scream tore from her lips too late, and the world spun. The car hit the guardrail and flipped, crashing into the embankment with a sickening thud. Glass shattered like raindrops. Metal crumpled like paper. Claire, unbuckled, was thrown from the vehicle, her body landing with devastating force on the cold, wet ground. The silence that followed was deafening. Sirens pierced the night soon after. Lights flashed red and blue against the trees. Officers rushed to the scene, their boots splashing through the rain-soaked mud as they followed the trail of destruction to where Claire lay. Her body was twisted, still breathing but barely, face pale against the darkness. An EMT called for a stretcher. Another checked her pulse. The rain kept falling, now gentle, almost warning. Kyle arrived moments later, breathless and soaked, his face etched with panic. He collapsed beside Claire, cradling her in his arms as if sheer willpower could undo what had happened. He screamed her name into the night, his voice raw, broken, primal. Why? He cried, over and over, to no one and to everything. Why had fate been so cruel? Why had this perfect day ended in horror? Why had he let her drive alone? Why hadn't he followed her sooner? But there were no answers, only the dull ache of tragedy unfolding in real time. Only the cold truth that life, no matter how carefully constructed, could unravel in an instant. The hospital was a blur of lights and motion. Doctors rushed Claire into surgery. Kyle sat in the waiting room, hands trembling, blood on his clothes. Jack and Diane soon arrived, their faces white with guilt and fear. Victor, too, stood in the shadows of the hospital hallway, arms crossed, jaw tight. No one said it aloud, but everyone felt that this wasn't just an accident. It was the culmination of fear, manipulation, and emotional war waged over Claire and Kyle's love. And now, Claire lay in limbo, her life hanging by a thread because of choices made by others, be those who claimed to love but refused to let go. As the hours passed, the fanbase that had once celebrated the engagement now lit up with horror. News of the accident spread quickly. Hashtags like Pray for Claire and Justice for Claire trended within minutes. Fan theories turned to prayers. The joy of the proposal video now played side by side with news headlines and raw images of the crash site. The contrast was heartbreaking. The pain was real. And the story, once a tale of love conquering all, had become a sobering reminder of how fragile happiness truly was. Inside Claire's hospital room, machines beeped rhythmically, monitoring every heartbeat, every breath. Kyle sat beside her, fingers laced with hers, whispering promises she couldn't yet hear. "Please come back," he said into the silence. "I still need you. We haven't even begun." And outside that room, the world waited. For news, for healing, for a miracle. But no matter what happened next, whether Claire woke or whether grief etched itself permanently into the fabric of their livest love they shared, had already changed everything. It had exposed the pettiness of control, the cruelty of fear, and the danger of pride. It had forced the powerful to look in the mirror and ask what they were willing to sacrifice to protect what they claimed to cherish. And most of all, it had reminded everyone watching that real love, once found, is worth everything, even if the world crashes down around it. If you'd like a continuation of what happens after this, including Claire's recovery, the emotional fallout with Diane, Victor's guilt, or Kyle's transformation, just let me know. In the aftermath of the accident, something shifted inside Kyle. The man who once believed he could will things into existence, love, peace, legacy, was now standing in front of a wall that refused to move. He had always been the fixer, the son of powerful men and women who taught him that with enough influence and persistence, anything could be bent back into shape. But not this. Not the way Claire's body lay motionless behind sterile glass. Not the way doctors whispered cautiously and nurses avoided eye contact. Not the way every passing second felt like a verdict against his faith. Tragedies like this weren't rare, he had heard. These things happened. People made mistakes. Cars lost control. It rained. It was dark. People forgot to fasten their seatbelts. And sometimes everything collided. But that explanation clinkle and convenient will never satisfy him. Not now. Not when Claire's engagement ring still had specks of blood on it. Not when the future they had dared to imagine together was now suspended in the air like an unanswered prayer. The wedding, of course, was no longer a topic anyone dared mention, not even as a cruel joke. The date that had been circled in Claire's planner, the venue she had whispered about wanting near the lake, the dress fittings she had secretly scheduled, they all faded into irrelevance the moment the paramedics found her on that wet road. Kyle didn't cancel anything formally. He didn't have to. The silence spoke for him. And yet, somewhere deep inside, he refused to believe it was over. He clung to the idea that the story wasn't finished, that Claire would open her eyes and remind him how stubborn she could be, how loudly she could fight for what she wanted, how fiercely she had defended their love. If anyone could survive this, it would be her. That's what he told himself. That's what he needed to believe. There was, however, one faint glimmer of hope. The decision to transfer Claire to a private medical facility in France had not been easy, but the Abbotts had the resources, and Kyle had the desperation. The doctors in Paris were among the best in the world, known for their quiet brilliance and absolute discretion. Specialists had already reviewed Claire's scans. One of them, a neurosurgeon with a reputation that stretched across continents, had said she might have a chance if the swelling receded, if the brain bleeds could be contained, if her body responded to the therapies. They used a lot of ifs, but it was more than what Kyle had heard in Genoa City. He accompanied her on the flight, never leaving her side, eyes hollow, heart burning. The Claire who had danced through his life like sunlight now lay still, a shadow of the woman he knew. But he wouldn't let go. Not yet. And yet, a whisper began to grow inside him. A whisper that started as guilt and slowly morphed into something darker, doubt. He began to question the nature of the accident. The police had ruled it a simple loss of control. Rain, speed, no seatbelt. Case closed. But Kyle couldn't silence the unease. Claire was reckless sometimes, yes, but not careless. She would never have risked her life on the night of their engagement. And why had she been so distracted? Why had her car veered off the road when that stretch of highway was familiar to her? Why had the music in her car been turned up so loud she couldn't hear her own tires screeching across the pavement? Then came the inconsistencies. The report noted something strange about the tire marks in a drag, as though another car had forced her off the road. A passing motorist had mentioned seeing headlights behind Claire's car shortly before the crash, then watching them vanish. The dash cam footage from a nearby gas station showed a shadowy vehicle following her moments before impact, too blurry to identify. And then there was the text message Claire had received less than 3 minutes before the crashing that had since mysteriously disappeared from her phone's records. Kyle had noticed it once in her call history. Now it was gone. Was it really an accident? The more Kyle dug, the more questions emerged. Someone had been following Claire. Someone had sent her a message meant to shake her. And someone had perhaps hoped that she wouldn't survive that night. But who? And why? Who would want to hurt Claire especially now, when she was on the cusp of happiness? Victor. The name came too quickly, but Kyle dismissed it just as fast. Victor Newman was manipulative, yes, and driven by power. But murder wasn't his gamut unless he absolutely needed it. Jack. Never. Diane. Her disapproval was toxic, but not homicidal. Perhaps a rival from Claire's past. She had enemies. That much was true. People who hadn't forgiven her for her role in previous deceptions. People who still believed she carried Newman's secrets in her blood. Or maybe someone within the Newman empire who saw her alliance with Kyle as a threat to dynastic purity. Maybe even someone who believed that killing Claire would destabilize the balance of power between Jabot and Newman Enterprises. And then, a possibility Kyle hadn't considered before began to grow roots. What if it wasn't just about Claire? What if he had been the target? What if her crash had been meant as a warning? After all, the Abbott name carried weight, enemies, and consequences. His relationship with Claire had thrown a wrench into the delicate equilibrium of corporate alliances and family politics. A union between a Newman and an Abbott could shift the balance of power. Some might consider it dangerous. Too dangerous to be allowed. Kyle's search for truth became obsessive. He requested security footage from every traffic camera, interviewed the first responders, even confronted former enemies of both families. He found dead ends. He found silence. But he also found much resistance for something that was allegedly just an accident. Emails were deleted. Access logs vanished. People who had been willing to talk suddenly refused. It was as if someone, somewhere, had flipped a switch and decided that this story needed to disappear. Back in France, Claire's condition wavered between fragile hope and terrifying silence. Some days her vitals stabilized. Other days, they dropped. Doctors refused to speculate. Kyle refused to leave. He kept a journal, documenting every moment of every blink, every breath, every twitch of her hand. He read it to her aloud, hoping she could hear. He promised her that he would find out the truth, that he would not let this go unanswered. And more than that, he promised her that if she came back, they would not let fear dictate their future again. But the question remained, hanging in the air like a noose. Who wanted Claire gone? And as Kyle looked around the private recovery suite, gazing at the bouquet of flowers with no name, the unsigned card, the anonymous calls to the nurse's desk, the feeling tightened in his chest. This wasn't over. This wasn't just tragedy. This was targeted. Someone had tried to silence Claire before she could become too powerful, before she could cement her place in both families, before she could marry Kyle. And until he found out who, he wouldn't rest, not even if it killed him too.